So we come now to the man who gets the final word. Our last presentation today is entitled Likely Issues in a Treaty Negotiation. So what issues are likely? And here to tell us what those issues are is Richard Paisley, who is director of the Global Transboundary International Waters Initiative and also Senior Research Associate, the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. Richard has had a wide variety of experiences in the academic, in the outreach, and in the private sector, and is an astute observer of legal goings-on between the United States and Canada. And he is certainly among those best qualified to pinpoint for us now what those likely issues are. Please join with me in welcoming Richard Paisley.
So, good afternoon. It's almost good evening. Thank you, organizers, panelists, audience, very much for being here. It's a great privilege and also a great responsibility to be sort of the last guy, right? So, and I realize that my very articulate and very good colleagues have already said much of what needs to be said about the Columbia. So I will try to add some value added from my perspective, which is I've had the privilege of working in a number of major international river systems around the planet. So the Mekong, the Nile, rivers in Central Asia, there's a nice one. In South America, different places. So hopefully I can, and Lake Tanganyika, I could go on and on. So I'm going to try to weave some of that into what I have to say. And I'm also going to try to do the unenviable task of capturing the essence of what others have said earlier in the day. I was going to say, the tone turned around in the afternoon, but after this morning, I was going to say, I can do doom and gloom as well as the next guy. Probably not as well as David Schindler. But if you have children, as I do, I don't go there, because we need to think about constructive solutions for moving forward. So much of what I say over the next while is going to be to talk about the First Nations, talk about the issues in the treaty negotiation, and try to move forward in a positive and constructive way. And I very much welcome your questions, comments, criticisms, denunciations. So I'm going to try to leave as much time as possible for dialogue. So the first slide I threw up was just to, that's an old slide, as you can tell by looking at the leaders of Canada and the United States at the time. But both Canada and the United States are on the cusp of a federal election, or well, we'll see what happens with the US, but Canada is certainly going to see an election very shortly. And this is an old slide. That's John Chrétien, remember him? On the left, and then who's the guy on the right? George W. Bush. Oh, there's another Bush running now, so it's a little confusing. But suffice it to say, one of the issues with the Columbia River Treaty is that it's a very, very important issue, but it's not the only issue that's going on between Canada and the US generally, and with water in particular. So that old joke, water gentlemen, yes, I'll drink Canada dry, says Bush, is sort of the elephant in the room on these issues, right? And that's been come up in other contexts. People talk about a continental energy policy, which in some people's minds at least is a euphemism for America taking Canada's water, as if we own the water, right? You don't have to be an astute observer of international law to know that we don't own the water. And Nigel and Barb spoke to the fact that allocation was not part of the Columbia River Treaty. But you can't help but wonder, in a world of increasing drought and seeing the intensity of the situation in California and even in British Columbia this year, if water allocation is not sort of, as I say, the elephant in the room. So keep that in mind when talking about the Columbia River Treaty. The next slide, as my colleague in the back there who's doing the slides pointed out, a bad copy off the internet by me. But we talk about, the fact that in this issue alone, the Columbia River, there are multiple sovereigns. There are multiple First Nations, multiple tribes. Local government has a huge role to play on both sides of the border. NGOs, I see Kat Hartwig's here, and others in the region on this side of the border, have a huge role to play. The private sector, you can never discount the private sector. You wouldn't believe the political clout the Idaho potato farmers have, let alone some of the other industrial players, Tech Kaminko and so on and so forth. And all with a wide range of rights and duties. I want to, you know, we always are quick to talk about rights. We don't always get there with duties and interests. And one of the things I want people to think about, or I think would be useful to people to think about, is all of these people, I'm going to lapse into very briefly negotiation speak, have, you know, substantive interests to be sure, but they also have procedural and psychological interests. And those are driving the Columbia River negotiations forward. My third sort of, what I'll call it opening observation, is that, and I may overstate this slightly, but all Columbia River treaty issues are necessarily Columbia River governance issues. But not all Columbia River governance issues are, or should they be, necessarily Columbia River treaty issues, which is a fancy way of saying that maybe we should be looking beyond the treaty just because we need to look beyond the treaty and talk about governance of the basin writ whole. If there was ever an opportunity to take a basin in North America between two historical friends who've worked together in cooperation, you know, the idea of one now discredited presidential candidate saying they should build a wall across the Canadian border sort of didn't go very far. And we have a long history of cooperation. I think if nothing else, and I'll come back to this, the Columbia River is seen by everyone I talk to all around the planet, literally, well, not quite that literally, but seen around by people everywhere as the example, if not the example of equitable sharing of benefits. And to throw that out would be, in my view, a tragic error. Okay. So with that in mind, sort of 4 issues for your consideration. What I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the 4 issues, 2 of which will be very familiar. Well, actually, all 4 of them will be very familiar because what others have said, but I'll try to give some value added on them. And then I'll talk about those 4 issues, and then I'll conclude with where I think the forward path is, where the opportunities really lie. Okay, so the 4 issues are flood control, which you've heard something about, benefit sharing, which is a personal interest of mine because that's what I do. I go around the world trying to show people that, as best I can, that cooperation is better than confrontation. I'll talk a little bit about ecosystem function because that's such an important topic, and salmon restoration, which is the flip side of ecosystem function. And finally, tribes and First Nations. And I see that famous I think it's Eldridge Cleaver quote, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I very much see tribes and First Nations as part of the solution for many of the reasons that were alluded to by the speakers this morning and this afternoon. Okay, so flood control. As you've heard, absent agreement to the contrary, the current flood control, we now call flood control flood risk management. That seems to be more politically correct. But regime expires in September 2024, i.e. the current well-developed system of assured flood control gets placed or defaults to a yet to be fully articulated system of called upon flood control. So the issues you've already heard are big issues, but possibly there's some opportunity, as Barb pointed out, for narrowing those issues. But the first issue is, what level do you protect to? And it's not, in my mind at least, not just a level of flow. It's how much risk are you willing to accept, right? That's a really important consideration. How much risk is the Corps of Engineers in this post-Katrina age willing to accept on the Columbia River, right? You know, a buddy of mine in the civil service used to refer to CTIs, career terminating incidents. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you can expect to see we saw after Katrina, and if somebody gets it wrong on the Columbia. And that situation we were talking earlier is exacerbated by the fact of climate change, right? Those 1 in 100-year floods that engineers love to design culverts to, we see them, I mean, they're happening all the time now. And it's only going to, the one thing we do seem to know about climate, one of the many things we know about climate change, and I defer to David Schindler and others on this, is that we're going to see more extreme events. There are going to be more, and there's going to be extreme. So that's a huge consideration. The other issue in flood control, and it's tied in again, is money, right? And it comes up in many forms, but one of the forms that comes up is the one Nigel referred to, was whether this effective use the Americans are obliged to post-2024 means only, well, first using only the USA federal dams already authorized for flood control, which has been the initial American position, or it means the USA must use all available storage. So there's two very different views on that right now, interpreting the agreement. So we'll see. And then whether compensation to Canada includes, as has been historically the case, compensation on the sharing of benefits, which is a very different thing and probably significantly less money, as restricted to compensation for actual losses and costs, okay? So we disagree as to, or there seems to be a threshold disagreement as to how much flood control is necessary or desirable, and then how we're going to do that, right? So it's a big issue. And the reason I say it's a big issue, as I said earlier, is because it seems to be the driving force, or one of the key driving forces, because in 2024, the do-nothing option that appeals to so many governments and politicians and human beings is not an option, because it's going to change, right? So somebody needs to deal with that. And I don't even get to what I call the, although it's of great interest to me at a number of levels, what the international legal, moral, ethical obligations are for Canada to prevent flooding in the USA, even if they don't get compensation. I mean, there's a very well-told story by Tim Newton, a really brilliant and charismatic guy who apparently gave some of the slides to Nigel, who Nigel and I know well, who was the hydro chief advisor. He was a Rhodes Scholar from South Africa and chief advisor to hydro in the Columbia River for many years. And he said, we were given the moral dilemma once of saying, there wasn't time to do something and so on and so forth, but this flood was coming, what should we do? And there was no question in their mind. You're going to do the right thing. You're going to hold back the water to prevent a flood. But, if people know you're always going to do the right thing without compensation, that leads to another sort of almost one of these prisoner's dilemma game simulations, right? And I'll talk about that again in the context of benefit sharing. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the political volatility of the flood issue in this post-Katrina age is enormous. So that's a big issue, and it's going to have to be worked out, hopefully cooperatively. The benefit sharing, I mentioned before, CRT, Columbia River Treaty, is well known throughout the world as a classic example, perhaps the classic example of equitable sharing of benefits. Equitable sharing of benefits between international watercourse states. It sounds like a good concept on its face, right? Essentially, as was noted earlier, in exchange for building 3 treaty projects in Canada and authorizing a 4th one, Libya in the United States, the Columbia River Treaty entitled Canada to a lump sum payment for irrigation and flood control benefits, although it was phrased in the form of flood control, largely, as well as, and this was the kicker, 1/2 of the additional power generated by the power plants in the USA that resulted from storage across the border in Canada. So without the dams in Canada, the USA could generate a certain amount of power. With the dams in Canada, they could generate a whole bunch more power. And they chose, after significant negotiation, to split those benefits 50-50. And in hindsight, and I've had the privilege, along with others, of talking to some of the original negotiators of the treaty, the genius, it turns out, hindsight is a wonderful thing, in the Columbia River Treaty was its simplicity, because they focused on gross benefits and they eliminated the need for each country to calculate net benefits, okay? So crucially avoiding what I would call the exceedingly difficult, if not impossible task of determining what the net benefits and costs of projects might be and what would be acceptable in both countries. So other places in the world, most notably where I'm doing a lot of very exciting, interesting, and very frustrating work in Central Asia, they have a water, energy, food nexus situation there where by cooperating, they could realize enormous benefits, right? But the problem there is the problem they solved in the Columbia is Tajikistan wants to benefit and Uzbekistan wants to benefit on a shared river, but their idea of winning is the other guy does lousy, right? They can't deal with the fact that somebody will get more benefit than what they get, right? And of course, measuring benefit is a sort of a precarious business at the best of times, because benefits, what is a benefit and how you measure it and how you compensate for it, is like values. Or not values, but like interests. They change over time, right? So the genius, there's a danger here if we start over monetizing things, that the genius, what I call the genius of the Columbia River Treaty, the thing that has made the Columbia River Treaty something that as Canadians and Americans, we're proud to say to people in Africa and Asia and the Americas, and the world is replete with examples where they've done similar benefit sharing agreements to some extent, is to not get into the minutiae and do it the way it's been doing. So even the critics of the Columbia River Treaty would tell you that by its own terms, the focus on flood control and power benefits, how would I say it? It's been a very successful and surprisingly, perhaps, successful treaty, okay? So having said that, the problem, one of the problems at least that has emerged, and it was alluded to by previous speakers, is that the United States, the only continuing flow of benefits back across the border from the United States into Canada is this so-called Canadian entitlement, right? And the Canadian entitlement is based on the amount of theoretical power that the Americans can generate on the American side with the benefit of Canadian storage. And the Americans aren't getting that benefit, all right? They're getting a fraction of that benefit because they're circumscribed by their own domestic environmental laws. So you can imagine if you're what's called a mid-sea utility, the mid-Columbia utilities, which are obliged to pay for the Canadian entitlement, and they see themselves sort of paying all this money for benefit they're not even getting, right? Now, Canada argues, hang on a second, the deal with benefits is you're not just getting flood control and power benefits. Canadians are giving you all kinds of benefits, navigation benefits, ecosystem benefits, fisheries benefits, and so on and so on and so forth, right? But the Americans, the mid-sea utilities say, A, we don't agree, and B, even if we did agree, we're not paying for those benefits because they're not power benefits, and the power benefits is all that interests us. And then it's gotten kind of more interesting because there's some U.S. interests. Well, some U.S. interests think that USA overpaid for flood control, let alone overpaid for power. Other U.S. interests advance the argument I sort of alluded to earlier, that why buy a cow when there's free milk coming across the border, right? Because they think it's the free rider argument, right? Those dams are in place in Canada. They are of the good faith, but who knows how diluted view, that Canada would largely have to run its dams the way it does already, and the Americans could just benefit without paying anything, right? So $200 million a year may seem trivial in the cosmic scheme of things, but it's a big issue to the mid-sea utilities, right? And they have enormous political clout, and well, they should in the United States. Some other interest, this is my personal favorite, some other U.S. interests advance what they call the mortgage argument. And I love that one. They say that we've paid off the mortgage, and now we're entitled to free rent, right? It's kind of like, as Kathy Eichenberger, the BC negotiator, said, you have a Ford factory, and once they've paid off the mortgage, they're going to give free Fords to everybody. I don't think it works quite that way. So, but that's seriously advanced by some people in the United States. So as I say, the major challenge, in my mind at least, is identifying some way, sort of, well, first of all, how past, present, and future losses in the Columbia Valley can be adequately compensated going forward. And I don't just mean the flooding losses. If you go to meetings, if you go to the Kootenays now and you see these flooded areas, and then you listen to people in public meetings, as I've done, it is a big issue. And the people like 1 and 2, and I get it, generations after the people who are actually flooded out, are passionate about these issues. I mean, the First Nations are equally passionate, but they are very passionate. And one of the unfortunate things that happened when they sort of bought out the interests of people in the valley bottoms is that they sort of the BC Hydro at the time sort of divided and conquered. If there was, it was like blockbusting in the U.S. years ago. There was 5 families that were in a row. They'd make a sweetheart offer to one of the people, and they would sell out, and the other people would be sort of left holding the bag, right? You know, and so even now, 3 generations later, there's still, I'm told, and I've seen it, bad blood between some of those families that they sold out, you know, 50 years ago, kind of thing, right? So there has to be a way to deal with that. But more important, there has to be a way for, and we talked, you know, actively, adaptively managing the fact that benefits, values, interests, costs on both sides of the border are changing constantly. And we have to do that without destroying the genius, what I call the genius of the Columbia River Treaty. And I'll conclude by making some thoughts on where we might go with that. So, oh, and also another thing that I think is important to me, and the thing, it was alluded to earlier by other speakers too, but there are different views on what should be in the treaty and what should be out of the treaty, and I'm not sure we'll ever have a clear consensus on that. But certainly, it's no secret that getting Senate approval for anything in the USA these days, and as you may know, treaties in the United States, well, there's some flexibility here, but in general require 2/3 of the majority, the advice and consent of the Senate, which has been interpreted in various ways. And there are those of the view, at least in Canada, that is a, you know, you will throw out the baby with the bathwater here. If the Americans are goaded into canceling the treaty, or alternatively, we try to open up everything, that's going to lead to, you know, where, you know, I don't know how many international treaties that the U.S. executive has endorsed or have never achieved Senate approval, but I think it's a considerable number. And given just what I read in the New York Times these days, it's not likely to get any better anytime soon. So, let alone obtaining sort of parliamentary approval in Canada with a minority government, as seems increasingly likely in Canada in the next year. So there's that. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay, so I was going to talk about ecosystem function, and I'll just allude to it briefly. It's a hugely important issue. It's the thing that hasn't been in the that hasn't been sufficiently dealt with. How do you define ecosystem function? I won't say there's as many definitions of ecosystem function as there are people who have definitions, but it's a difficult concept to really operationalize. Although I know Jim Heffernan and others have some good views on that need to be taken into consideration. The more interesting question to my mind is, how do you balance it in an efficacious way with flood control and power? And how do you set up the administrative mechanisms that would actually operationalize that in a way that's fair and equitable to everybody? And so I'm going to talk about solutions, as I say, but before I do that, I want to add something to or try to add something to the tribes and First Nations issue. Now, first of all, I got to say there's some world-class First Nations experts in this room. You know, Nigel and Krista and Jim and others. So, you know, this is not my area, so I don't want to get in over my head too quickly, or I'll bail very quickly if I do. But suffice it to reiterate what some others have said. First of all, that the First Nations and tribes were conspicuously not included in the negotiations up until, you know, that led to the Columbia River Treaty. And there has been an revolution in their legal and political status and profile on both sides of the border since then. Jim is an expert on the Bolt decision in the U.S. and how that played out, and then the repatriation of the Constitution and so on and so forth. Suffice it to say that the tribes and First Nations on both sides of the border, in my view, have a number of substantive interests, including benefit sharing. They got nothing the first time. Including rectification of historical wrongs, not just an issue with them, again. Including ecosystem function, including salmon restoration. And they also have procedural interests, and that is very important, and that includes what I call a seat at the table. So any negotiations that go on about either the Columbia River Treaty or Columbia River governance writ large, they want to be part of that negotiation. And they're not the only ones. The local governments are agitating to be part of that. And you know, the NGOs are agitating to be part of that. And so it becomes an interesting question how to do that. And then there's, last but not least, psychological interests. When you've been so badly treated for so many years and suddenly you have some rights and responsibilities, then there's some psychology going on. As here, right? Your psychological interests become important. They're looking for, I mean, among other things, obviously for respect, right? Okay. So, next slide. Oh, just this is my it's kind of like a Game of Thrones thing, right? You got the big wall. I love this particular slide of the Columbia River Basin, but the next slide is the one I'm looking for. Oh yeah, okay. So this, see what's happening here. This is a guy who's about to go to battle with bows and arrows, and there's a guy sitting here with a Gatling gun, and he's saying, and the king is saying, no, I can't be bothered to see any crazy salesman. We've got a battle to fight. Okay, so with that sort of in mind, I have, I guess, a couple of thoughts to share with you in conclusion. The first one I've already alluded to, and I won't dwell there. It's some careful thought as to which issues, interests can best be dealt with, both from a legal and a pragmatic point of view, within the treaty and outside of the treaty. And I think probably it would be possible to give that, to reach some kind of consensus on that, and including with the ecosystem function idea. The second sort of thought I'll share with you is that, believe it or not, the Columbia River is not the only international river in the world. It's not also the only international river between Canada and the United States. Interesting factoid, because Canada on the Mercator projection is above the United States, most people, are, as I was, are of the good faith, but turns out wrong view that most of the water in Canada flows into the United States on our transboundary rivers. It turns out that, I'm told that 60% of the water on the transboundary flows from Canada and the United States, but 40% flows the other way. So all to say, though, that of those 276 other international rivers out there, a number of which I've had the privilege to work on and help forge agreements and implement those agreements, which is even more interesting and challenging. There have been major strides since 1960 in the state of the art of what works in international treaties to govern water and energy and related matters and what doesn't. So things like active adaptive management, which is a term that's been thrown around by a number of people and I think is a real useful and important concept. The idea that whatever we do, we're probably going to get it wrong. This is my simple layman's interpretation of active adaptive management. Whatever we do, we're going to screw it up. So we should go ahead knowing that's going to happen. And David can help me with a better definition maybe. But this is the way I see it. Both on the scientific side and on the political side, we should have a management that's self-correcting, or as self-correcting as we can make it. And on, the other advantage of active adaptive management, and obviously I've given this a little bit of thought, is that at best in decision making, even on the Columbia, historically and even today, science gets used what I call episodically. There's a big rush, they bring in the big guns, they make a decision, and then they kiss them off, and then they go and do whatever they're going to do. Whereas what really needs to happen, in my respectful submission, is that science, and I have a science background a little bit, needs to be used adaptively, and it needs to be used, constantly, and we need to examine what we do and then say, okay, we didn't get that right, and then we're going to rectify and correct and move forward. So, and what a wonderful opportunity with the Columbia River to actually, walk the walk instead of just talk the talk on something like that. So these other river systems, I can show you, well, Nigel can too, and I'm sure Barb, all of us, examples where, active adaptive management, participation in decision-making, ecosystem function, and trade-offs. We can show you the lesson, we can share, and I've had the privilege of running a major UN project that actually did this, looking at governance of international waters, and the kinds of things that work and the kinds of things that don't work. It's a very difficult thing to do because every international river basin is actually so difficult, politically, hydrologically, economically, socially, and every other way, that it's hard to draw lessons learned. But there are some truisms that kind of emerge out of the thing, and active adaptive management is certainly one of them. Dispute resolution is another one. Institutional architecture, form follows function, subsidiarity principle. You do things at the localist level you can that will actually make it work. All good stuff that doesn't seem to be part of the talk in the Columbia River. And finally, predicting the weather. Before we came here, we looked at the weather forecasts, and interestingly, some of the forecast, Environment Canada was convinced it was going to be sunny every day. most of the other forecasts were sort of less sanguine. They kind of caught the rain thing. But when you think, somebody explained about weather forecasting once, that the story there is, it's based on models and algorithms and it's computers and offshore, this and that, and so on and so forth. But when you think about it, the easiest way, the most likely possibility of the weather tomorrow is what it was today, right? Because it's continuity, right? So to actually predict a change is a difficult thing to do, and so that I think holds over into human nature as well. Machiavelli famously said, "There's nothing more difficult to do." I'm paraphrasing badly. More uncertain of a success than to try to institute a new order of things, right? Because the old regime has the law on its side and inertia, but then there's the incredulity of mankind who can never believe anything till they've had actual experience of it. And so it's with that thought that I've had the privilege of working with the university's consortium on Columbia River governance to try to advance a different way of looking at the Columbia generally, right? And it's working with tribes and First Nations. And many of the people in this room I've had the privilege of working with on that. And what it is, we put out a report called A Shared Response, or Sacred Responsibility. And it was an interesting report, and I'll put it on the website. But what it did, it looked at the role, the emerging role of First Nations and tribes in international law and international water management, and it tried to meld those together. But it was also, because of my background and experience in part, a very practical document. We talked about how the tribes and First Nations could play a meaningful role in the evolution of what we stole a term from international diplomacy, a track two diplomatic process. And that's there's variations on the theme, but basically that's when like-minded people or well-minded people from all walks of life, academics, scientists, politicians, First Nations, tribes, meet informally with sort of Chatham House rules, not for attribution, and they try to imagineer a better way of governance for something like the Columbia River. And those kinds of processes, I think, are very achievable, and even if they're not, if not now, when? And if not who, why not us? And if not led by the First Nations and tribes, who else is going to take the lead in this? The point of the weather story was it's incremental. I mean, the smart money, to be candid, it seems to me, is now saying there won't be very many changes in the Columbia River Treaty, right? It's too complicated, it's too controversial, like what I told you, Senate approval is impossible, the politicians, so I think real change will have to be driven externally. And it's back to what John F. Kennedy's famous quote, "Ask not what the government can do for you, ask what you can do for the government." So I encourage, I'm a little biased here, but I encourage all of you and everyone here and anyone, if you have a real interest in seeing change in the Columbia River and water governance generally in international basins, let alone domestic basins, then give this idea of the tribes and First Nations helping to initiate and lead a Track 2 process that would involve not just tribes and First Nations, but NGOs and local communities on both sides of the border, and government people and scientists as well. Give it a shot, because we have everything to gain and nothing to lose. It's like risk insurance. Yes, everybody may get a seat at the table, and this may all turn out well, and we'll all sing Kumbaya. But if that doesn't work out, it's kind of like active adaptive management. Then here's another opportunity. So thank you for letting me bend your ear, and I, along with the other members of the panel, look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
All right, questions or comments, please? Sir.
So under this original agreement, how many people were affected, and what was the compensation? Was it just strictly monetary, or were there kind of like land swaps for the natives, or like, I don't understand the basics, like when it was signed?
Sure. I don't know is this on? I don't know the exact numbers of people that were affected, but one of the challenges was that it was all the best land that was affected, right? Because it was in all the valley bottoms in Canada, right? And so that was a serious issue. And my understanding is the only real compensation they got historically, anybody got, was BC Hydro bought out individuals and then moved them, right? And they, at what ostensibly was fair market value, but whether it was really fair market value or not, I don't know. There was some hard negotiations went on. The only exception to that is that many years later, many decades later, after continual lobbying on behalf of the people of the Columbia River Valley in Canada, they were able to create the Columbia Basin Trust, which Barb alluded to. And they gave them an endowment of close to $300 million, some of which, interestingly, they turned the Columbia Basin Trust, and that was supposed to give benefit back to the community and fund good works in the community and education and so on and so forth. And they've been very successful at that. But interestingly, they took quite a bit of that money, or I don't know how much exactly, but they invested in power projects in the Columbia Valley. So they are both benefiting from the power projects, but they got that money originally. And so, but what about, as somebody alluded to, I guess it was Nigel, that in the Okanagan Valley, which is part of the hydrologically connected to the main stem of the Columbia, there was no compensation given to anybody, as far as I know, and until recently, the Sockeye Run, which has now been slightly rebuilt. I say slightly. The Okanagan First Nation, put their heart and soul into getting Sockeye back into the Okanagan Lake. But unfortunately, with the drought this year, or water shortage, I guess, the salmon had a really hard time. So, and just on that point of salmon restoration, I can't say enough about. The iconic value of salmon to First Nations and tribal people. I shouldn't be telling you that anyway. They should be telling you that, but they tell it, and they tell it very poignantly. And so it's one thing to figure out the value of a salmon in monetary terms, and each salmon is worth something. But the spiritual and iconic value is. And you only have to go to a First Nations salmon feast on either side of the border, and it just blows you away. Let alone the ecological value. What happened to all those ecosystems that were dependent on salmon decaying when they spawned, right? So it's a big issue. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but thank you.
Hi. Hi, over here. You mentioned that there are, of course, a number of international rivers in Canada here. Particularly, I'm thinking about here in Alberta, the Milk River. What kinds of things that should we be thinking about when we're talking about maybe cooperation, international cooperation on these kinds of rivers here in Alberta or elsewhere in Canada?
I know a little bit about the Alberta rivers, but I think Nigel's probably better placed than me to say something, if that's okay.
Okay, I welcome that.
So there is a long history of cooperation on the Milk St. Mary, as you know, going back to the time of the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. In fact, those shared basins were the foundation of, one of the key drivers of the Boundary Waters Treaty. I guess there is a treaty arrangement which has worked significantly to the benefit of Canada and Alberta in particular, because of the flows of the St. Mary. So I guess every basin has got its own particular characteristics, and I think it's hard to generalize. But I guess one lesson I think that does come out of the Milk St. Mary is this. The treaty says certain things about how to share the waters of, and that arrangement very much is an apportionment arrangement. Not really concerned with power or flood control. It's actually concerned with apportionment for irrigation purposes. But the treaty said certain things, which set some ground rules. an IJC order, this is the International Joint Commission established by the Boundary Waters Treaty, elaborated on that in 1921, and then the parties themselves, the actual officers who are administering the sharing, have further elaborated on that, constantly asking this question: what are the win-win opportunities, and how can we share those benefits? I think the other lesson from the Milk St. Mary is, I mean, Montana says we're not really getting the benefits we should get under the Article 6 of the Boundary Waters Treaty. But one of the reasons for that is, I think, a failure to invest. That is, on the U.S. side of the border, you're looking at an infrastructure system which hasn't really been maintained, and it's hard to blame Canada for that. It's rather an issue that has got to be assumed by those people who use that irrigation system.
Okay, last comment.
Thank you. My name's Natasha. I'm with the Polis Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. And my question was regarding your point about First Nations needing to, or being the right people to lead and initiate change in water governance. Mm-hmm. So my question is around whether you might be able to identify areas where additional capacity is needed to drive some of that change.
Okay, additional capacity, and what did you have in mind? So.
Well, I'm thinking about what do First Nation communities and leaders need, and what do local governments need and community groups need to be the drivers for change.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure exactly where to begin, but it seems to me that they need a couple of things. One was, it turned out, and they asked us for this, and we fortunately were able to give it to them, was a sort of an enhanced awareness and appreciation of understanding of international law. I'm hopelessly biased, but it seems to me that, has always seemed to me that international waters are different, right? And one of the biggest challenges I've always had, whether I'm wearing my Canadian Parks and Wilderness hat or my academic hat or my UN negotiator hat, is convincing people they don't own the water in an international river. At best, they're entitled to, well, they are at best. They're under international law, they have a right to a reasonable and equitable share of the beneficial uses of the water. And that's very different than ownership. But trying to convince Kyrgyzstan of that, or trying to convince Afghanistan of that, or trying to convince Ethiopia of that is not easy. And I think some of those myths have, so education, I think, is a critical part of it. And education in a thoughtful and peer-to-peer way, because they have a lot that they can teach us as well. And I've certainly, I'm always feel very sheepish, both here and internationally, because I always feel I learn so much more from people that I'm working with than I'm able to give them, right? And so it's humbling, to say the least. And then as part of that first point, I think capacity building as well. I mean, I would love to see a cadre of young tribes and tribal people and First Nations people who had they certainly have the passion, but had the background and the skills and so on. But I think I'd ask Jim Heffernan to sort of follow up on that question, because he works very closely with tribes and First Nation. He has a much more hands-on opportunity than I do. One of the things that's happened also is, this is no secret, in the United States, there have been a successful attempt to forge a coalition, and they call it the coalition, right, of tribes with, and believe me, the tribes are not unlike anyone else on the planet. In the United States, they have their differences, they have their similarities, they have their differences, they have their interests, they have different interests. They're upstream, they're downstream, they're everything else. But they've managed to forge a coalition which will, I think, is very likely to inure to their benefit in terms of any negotiations, well, on anything really, but certainly on the Columbia River Treaty and Columbia River governance. Alas, the Canadian First Nations, although very interested and certainly have the potential and the wherewithal, have not yet reached that point. So the Ktunaxa, the Okanagan, and the Shuswap are still haven't got a similar coalition to the U.S. Does it have to be the same? I don't think so. Would it be to their benefit? Well, maybe not, but I kind of think it might be, right? And what they really bring to the table, though, and as I say, it's part of that reciprocal exchange of thought and ideas, is that worldview that Gordon alluded to and others have alluded to. It really is where we're going to have to go, I think. Obviously, not all First Nations share that view. Not all tribes share that view. I mean, it's like everything else. There's people who share that view, and there's people that don't share that view. And there's some very capitalistic First Nations out there. What a surprise! There's very capitalistic everybody else out there too. But I think that kind of view needs to come in, and the more it comes in, and the more opportunities there are to do that, the more likely, the more successful we're going to be in aggregate. But Jim, did you want to? I put you on the spot here, but did you want to say something?
As far as capacity building, to become a co-manager, that means that you're not. To become a co-manager, you're not relying upon the federal agencies or a state agency to represent you. So you've got your own policy staff. I think the First Nations are making a move to that. They've actually developed, as a result of some past collaboration, a youth team to bring young people into the fold and get them more familiar with what the management issues are. Until you have the capacity from within the First Nation, though, you're looking for policy analysts and lawyers, solicitors. And then equally as important, perhaps more important, is your own modeling team that's got the model and is actually running the models as you're suggesting they should be run. One of the issue that drove the Coalition of 15 Tribes to come together and to develop with the U.S. entity the sovereign participation process was a rejection of the idea of the U.S. entity coming to the tribes and saying, we're going to run some models and we'd like to consult with you about those outputs. And the tribal leaders have said, no, as co-managers, we'd like to collaborate and coordinate with you, actually have our modelers working together with you to run the models so that we all know what's going in and we all understand what the outputs are. That's how you get to co-management. So it's a question of policy staff, and key is modeling staff.
That reminds me that one of the key things, I think, no matter who does what, is that there's collaboration on the information gathering. And I can show you example after example. One of the most farcical was in Bhutan in India, where they wanted to build some big projects. And first the Bhutanese hired a consultant, and the Indians didn't trust him. Then the Indians hired a consultant, and then the Bhutanese didn't trust him. They spent all this money, millions of dollars. And then the Bhutanese and the Indians hired a consultant together, and the World Bank didn't trust them, and they were funding the project. So finally, somebody figured out, hey, why don't we all sit down and do joint terms of reference and do the studies together? And guess what? It worked. And so easy to say, but it took them 10 years and I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars. So my fear now is both, they did one collaborative study and now everybody's becoming very guarded with proprietary information, right? And so everybody's going off in potentially different directions right now. So that would be another self-serving argument in favor of a Track 2 diplomatic initiative where we could pick people in their personal capacities who have knowledge and expertise and interest and passion, and we wouldn't have to be circumscribed by the necessary. I get the need for confidentiality. I've been involved in enough international negotiations, but at some point we need to find a way to ameliorate that, and that would be one way of doing it. So.
All right, thank you. We've come to 5 o'clock and the end of the program. Let me ask you first, sir. Yes, thank you. To join with me in thanking Richard Paisley and all the other presenters here today. Thank you, everybody. Second, you will find this little piece of paper at your place on the table. It is an evaluation of this event, and it will take you 20 seconds to fill it out. Please fill it out. If you don't fill it out, you will be collared by the security force of the Banff Center and brought back here to sweep out the room. And let me ask Vince to say a few words.